Welcome to the Autopian podcast. We are back at season 2. Things are about to get exciting. We have a special guest, Rod Emory, one of the world's greatest Porsche customizers.
Yeah. Originator of the Outlaw concept.
I need to start.
We're getting ahead of ourselves.
I need to start with.
I'm excited.
Rod.
We're very excited.
Yeah. Is that short for push or for connecting?
Depends on who you're talking to.
Okay.
Good question, though, David.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay,
good dad joke to launch the podcast with here. We're trying to impress our special guest.
That's all.
We're trying to act cool around here, David.
You forgot
someone super cool here.
Panhard was right there.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Well, Rod, seriously, thank you for coming on the Autopian podcast. We're really excited to have you here. And there's so much I want to ask you and talk to you about because you and your family are legendary in the car customizing community. And for those who might not know, and I'd like to learn a little bit more, but your grandfather started Valley Custom Shop in, I believe, 1948?
Yeah, late 47, early 48.
Wow. Now, so at Galpin, we started in 46. We've been customizing cars since 1952. You've been customizing cars longer than anyone else I know, which is amazingly cool to me. And I'm just curious, kind of, how did your grandfather get started? What did he start working on? And then how did your dad get into it? Yeah,
so, my family kind of originated right here in the Valley. My grandfather lived in Burbank, right off Alameda, kind of over where Providence Hospital is now. And in kind of the 20s, 30s, he started out delivering newspapers to Toluca Lake. So riding his bicycle around Toluca Lake, delivering newspapers, and met a few movie executives early on when he was, just in school. And those executives were like, hey, would you, clean my car and, start doing a little bit of detailing work. So he'd go over to some of the dirt parking lots at the studios and he'd wash cars. And the next thing you know, they're like, hey, do you have a driver's license? He's like, nah. Would you take my car over and put wheels and tires on it? So it was really just kind of in the beginning. He had this little, note card business where he was taking care of executives' cars and people that had money. And then a couple years later, the war hit, and he was shipped off to Alameda and was in the Navy. And there was one night that I think one of the generals crashed their car and came into the barracks before it was, I think, during kind of basic training. And they came in, asked everybody in there if there was anybody that knew body and fender. And because they had a car that was cracked up. And so my grandfather's like, I can do it. And I think he was, 18 years old. And
could he do it at that time?
Well, he was kind of one of these guys that can do anything, right?
Right on.
Or at least thought he could do anything.
Yeah.
And so he banged the fender out, did some paint work, and they said, okay, well, now you're in the motor pool. So he never got shipped off. He did his time at Alameda, kind of head of the motor pool and working on cars and learned how to weld and learned how to, use machine tools and had access to all that equipment. And then in, a few years later, after he got out, he and his brother-in-law, Clayton Jensen, rented a building just right over by Leno's. The building's no longer there, but it was a little gas station, and started Valley Custom Shop. In the beginning, the first building was pretty small, had a couple of bays in it, a couple of gas pumps, and it was Jensen and Emory, and then said Valley Custom Shop on it. And one of their first customers or collaborations was Alex Exidius with SoCal Speed Shop. Amazing. And if you're familiar with the belly tanker that Bruce has,
absolutely.
My grandfather did the headrest and some of the louvers and some of that early metal work on that car.
That is so cool.
And then
was that one of the first belly tank cars?
I think it was. Like it was, if not one of the first. It was the first. I guess highly exposed one because it was in all the magazines, right?
Let's explain.
First famous for sure.
We should explain belly tank cars to our listeners because they're fascinating, and we have to assume not everybody who's listening may know, but these were drop tanks from aircraft, from World War II aircraft, like the extended fuel tanks that were streamlined little teardrops. And then what would they do? So these guys would come back from the war and they'd get them surplus, and then how would they turn them into an actual little hot rod?
Well, you got to remember, Lockheed was right here. All the aviation, was right here in the valley. They were building airplanes, and so a lot of that stuff was surplus in the area. And so shops like SoCal Speed Shop, he wants to go out and break land speed records, so they would, build a small little, frame and build a flathead for it, and then they needed a body. And so they would use, instead of shaping it out of just sheets of aluminum, it's like, here's this perfect little aerodynamic streamlined shape.
Already done, yeah.
Perfect.
So, Alex had...
Aluminum, I'm guessing?
Aluminum.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So the original belly tanker was gold and white, kind of a gold or bronze colored and white.
Right.
Eventually it became red and white, but I'll get into that. But it was gold and white, and they had to cut an opening and and cut all the openings for the axles and roll the edges and do a fairing or a headrest and louvers. So that was the original belly tanker. Wow. And then if the name Dean Batchelor rings a bell, so Dean was one of the if you look in all the early custom car magazines, Carcraft, Road and Track, Dean was working for Peterson and he would go to all the shops and do like how-to chop channel section type stuff and write articles on it. He was my grandfather's best friend. So my grandfather's name was Neil Emory. Cool. And he was the best man in my grandfather's wedding. And so Dean was always doing these kind of, articles on how to customize stuff because he'd go into my grandfather's shop. Right. Well, Dean had an idea with Alex Exidius that they wanted to be the first hot rod over 200 miles an hour. So in 1948, 1949, they took the belly tanker that they'd already kind of tested and, run, and they took the body off of it. And so here's the body sitting here, here's the frame. And Dean came to my grandfather and said, we need to build an envelope-bodied race car. And so that was what was called the SoCal Streamliner. I think it was late 48, 49, starting with just sheets of aluminum. They built a full-bodied, kind of envelope-bodied.
And just again to clarify to our audience, envelope body means not separate fenders and body. It's one thing that encompasses everything.
That encompasses everything, covers the wheels, kind of everything, right?
So no bolt-on panels at all.
Yes, exactly. So there were bolt-on panels. If you look right there.
Oh yeah, look at that thing.
So when it's in black and white, right there in front of SoCal Speed Shop. That was, right in the beginning, kind of the first version before they painted it white.
Wow.
But they built that body around the belly tanker chassis. So over there on the right-hand side. And so that, they went on to race that car and,
how low it is.
Yeah, and it was awesome. And it ended up going over 200 miles an hour in 1949, 1950.
Wow.
And, then the car was totaled. I think it was in Daytona Beach when it got wrecked. Don't quote me, but so the car got totaled, and then Alex.
By the way, that's still the standard is 200 miles an hour, and you're still joining the 200 mile an hour club.
Yeah,
I mean, still 70 some years later. That's still the standard that your grandfather helped create.
Yeah,
amazing.
So he built the body.
Incredible.
SoCal Speed Shop built the chassis and running gear, and it was over 200 miles an hour in 1950.
Where was where did it get cooling air? Or did you not bother because the runs are short?
Very little, just right next to the headrest.
Oh, there's louvers right there.
Yeah, just the louvers. But they were just short runs, right?
There? Yeah.
It's they did all the testing at El Mirage, and then they would go out and so this was actually a recreation that Dan Webb did because the car was totaled. So the one in
Baraluna. Still around?
Well, so what they did is that car got totaled. They retrieved some of the chassis and engine parts, and then they rebuilt a new chassis, and then the version of the belly tanker that Bruce has now is the original body, but on a new frame because they had to rebuild it because the crash damaged the frame significantly.
Yeah, but.
So he was building, land speed record kind of hot rods, but he was also.
And to me, by the way, one of the most important cars there is. And
I agree.
And just so much incredible history all wrapped up in one little package. So, just amazing.
So his shop his partner was Clayton Jensen, his brother-in-law, and they were really the pioneers of channeling and sectioning. There were lots of hot rod shops, and there was the Barrises, there was Winfield, there was the list goes on and on. You guys got into the customizing game in the Valley, and my grandfather, he was really focused on channeling and sectioning. So
let's give a definition of that too. Sorry to keep interrupting for this, but I want to make sure people know. So tell us, what do you mean when you say channeling and sectioning?
So when you think of custom cars, there's a number of things that kind of happen. There's chopping the top, which is kind of the most visual, the thing that people can really
Model
pick up
A,
on.
you see that a lot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so these days everybody's really slamming the roof.
Slit windows. And things.
So chopping the top was very common. Channeling is where essentially they're mostly body on frame cars.
Yeah.
So you're cutting the floor and basically the bottom of the car out, and then you're channeling the body over the frame.
Oh, so you're changing the body where the body mounts to the frame?
Exactly.
So it goes
so you're
up?
dropping. It's kind of like a body drop, right?
Yeah.
So
That
you're
makes sense.
channeling it. You're channeling it over the frame.
Got it.
So it gives the car. It allows the suspension to still be
Full
functional.
travel, but less. It's more.
There's a lot of work to channel because you're moving the inner fender wells up and you're changing the
That's a huge amount of
the
work.
firewall
A
and
body
everything.
lift is incredibly easy. A body drop is like, it's not meant to do that. Yeah.
So back in the day, that was that's what they were doing was channeling. They were also one of the first ones to do like Zing a frame or taking and C-sectioning a frame over the rear axle and all of that. And they had I have these awesome pictures of some of the early lowering kits that they were building for 40 Fords and so they were building actual front suspension like lowering kits. Like my grandfather always had these ads that were just super funny that were basically I wish I could quote them, but don't just heat up the springs.
Right, I remember that was the old cheap method.
Yeah,
You heat the springs till
don't
it
heat the
settled down.
springs. Don't be a custom miser and just heat up your springs. Buy a lowering kit from Valley Custom Shop.
Yeah, right on.
And then the other thing is that everybody back in the day there was a lot of lead slingers, right? They were throwing lots of lead at the cars, and my grandfather and great uncle, they were really focused on proper metal work and hammer welding everything and they used lead, but let's metal finish as much as we can.
Right.
I think one of them was a pound of lead is worth 1,000. Anyways, he had all these little sayings that he would say, but that's my grandfather right there when he was
right on.
customizing. But so channeling is dropping the body over the frame.
Yeah.
And then sectioning, which is the hardest, is if you look at cars right there. So that's a car called the Polynesian. And that's when they were.
Myron Furnace has that now.
Yes, Myron has that.
I've seen that car. It's
so
beautiful.
So that car is sectioned 5 inches. So imagine, the cars from the 30s, 40s, early 50s, the bodies were really thick.
Yeah.
The doors. You think about a 4-foot thick door, and the cars were really thick in the midsection.
Right.
And my grandfather loved the European styling of cars, the Italian styling, and cars were a lot sleeker and thinner. And, you look at some of the Jaguars, you look at stuff, and everything's just thinner, right? Yeah. So he would take, a 50 Oldsmobile, and he says, okay, well, let's take 5 inches out of it. And so you don't, you would think, oh yeah, you just cut it, but because there's so many compound curves and the fenders and so many different planes. It's actually like if you look at the side section of the Polynesian when it was sectioned, it's kind of like this all the way down. And so he would take 5 inches out, and so he would lay it out. A lot of times he would just lay it out right on the ground first. He'd draw it all out, and then he'd go to the car and he'd sketch it out. And then back then, they didn't have Milwaukee tools that they could just slap a battery in. I mean, they had big body grinders, and one of my favorite tools that my grandfather had is he'd take a leaf spring and he'd sharpen it to like a razor's edge, and he'd put his, like when he was channeling cars, he'd put the leaf spring on the ground and he'd hold it with this hand, and he'd take a sledgehammer and he would beat on it, and he would slice the metal, like cut it like butter with a leaf spring that he ground down to a knife's edge, right? Because they didn't have grinders. They would just slice right through it. Wow. So channeling and sectioning were really kind of the things that they mastered. And because Dean Batchelor was documenting all this stuff, he was writing articles on how to section a 54 shoebox Ford, and it'd be in the magazine and it'd travel around the world, and then all these other customizers would see that and they'd be like, I'll take my Merc and I'll section it, or I'll take the body line out.
That's how you change car culture there.
Well, and the Polynesian, which, by the way, we just saw in person, Amelia, just gorgeous. And a true work of art. If you think about taking the center section out, because you're cutting it twice, and then matching those body panels, and that takes true vision and artistry, and obviously a massive amount of skill. But just because it's art and science, it just incredible work.
Yeah, it was really his thing. He loved to smooth out the body lines.
It's beautiful.
And you look at those cars and you think, okay, that was done, and those were done in the 40s and 50s.
Yep.
And that was just. It was ahead of its time, and because so many of the car companies had design studios out here in California where they were watching what the customizers were doing. If you kind of look at automotive design in the U.S. and you think of the stuff that these customizers were doing in the San Fernando Valley, all that carried through. Look at the Corvette, look at the Thunderbird,
they were basically making concept cars for them.
That's right.
Really. If you think
and then you'd see where
body lines,
concept cars were starting to look like some of the customs.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful, magical time, in my opinion.
Jason, do you want to describe
I agree.
the look of this?
Yeah, we should describe what the Polynesian looks like for people listening in. So it in a lot of ways, it feels like a car of the era, but everything is leaner. It's reduced in size, so it's got a sleek, cleaner look. It's also been detrimmed to some degree. The headlights are Frenched in. It's less bulky. So it's got a lot of the things you associate with like an early 50s car, but distilled down to the essence where it all of a sudden transforms and makes more sense. It's more live.
Well, it's exactly what you said, where the American cars are big and bulky.
Yeah.
This definitely has a sleeker, more European appearance to it, but
Rod,
it's still all American.
If you have a better, more eloquent way to describe this, please have at it.
I mean, one of the things that my grandfather, always kind of instilled in me as a young kid is the magic is in customizing or changing everything, but make everything look as if it wasn't customized.
That's right.
Yeah, that's.
And so, when I was a kid growing up, hanging out with my grandfather, my uncle who was his apprentice, my dad who's just this, crazy, brilliant parts guy. I had an opportunity to learn every nut and bolt of cars and to really pick up on all that stuff from them. And it's just,
What was that like growing up in a family that car centric? Was it like forced upon you? Was it just kind of a natural, like you were into it from day one, or?
So yeah, I mean, if we kind of look at the trajectory of the family a little bit, my grandfather had Valley Custom Shop until 1961, and then left the Valley. He went down to Newport Beach because a good friend of his who owned a car lot here in the San Fernando Valley bought the Porsche Volkswagen dealership in Newport Beach. So Chick Iverson took my grandfather and my family and kind of transplanted them to Orange County. My dad then worked in the parts department at Chick Iverson, and my uncle then was my grandfather's apprentice in the body shop. So yeah, my whole family worked together at this Porsche dealership. And then
legendary Porsche dealership. And the fact that the family was there. Just again, so much history. It's just fantastic.
Yeah. So my dad, obviously, he loved being in a family, environment with his dad and his brother, and so naturally, I was always my dad's sidekick. I was born in the 70s, and my dad was in the Porsche parts business, and I was immediately just kind of given the opportunity to be in it and amongst it. I was never forced into it. It was something that really came naturally. Well, I was born at Hoag Hospital in Newport Beach, and my dad gave me my first ride home from the hospital the day I was born in a 65 911 with flares and a ducktail and 9s and 11s on it. So I kind of had no choice but to love these cars and cars. So for me it was kind of
So you kind of took the history of your grandfather and then what your father had done, and you put them together, and
now
doing what you're doing.
Yeah, to kind of give you an inside look on what kind of makes me tick. I mean, being in an environment where my dad had a Porsche parts business. So when I was 5-6 years old, I used to sit at his parts counter and go through the old microfiche. You remember? At a parts department, right?
Yeah.
Before computers.
Yeah.
And so to kind of keep myself occupied, my dad would be like, just why don't you pull up, one of those microfiche films and go pull all the parts out of the warehouse and put them on the, on the bench. And I'm 5-6 years old, and I'd look at the part number, I'd go down the aisles, I'd go over to the shipping table, and I'd find all the parts for a front suspension for a 356, and I'd lay them all out. And my dad would be like, yeah, good.
Wow.
And then he'd say, okay, go put them away.
Were you carrying that?
He knew how to keep you busy.
But so for me, that was like, that was awesome, because it was like, it was like going shopping and digging through, Porsche parts. And
So are you pretty good with part numbers?
I'm not as good as my dad with part numbers, but yeah, I know the Porsche part number sequencing system is pretty simple. It seems complex, but it's the Germans were very thought out, and so it's a sequencing. So once you learn the sequencing, that the first 3 numbers are the model, the second 3 numbers are a certain section of the car, the third 3 sequences hone in a little bit more, and then the variation is the last 2 digits.
Really?
Then you kind of understand that.
So if you looked at a part number, you could tell me what cars it's for, what part of the car it's for, roughly.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, because it's a part numbering sequence, So like 644, the earliest 356s were started with 356, but then they went to 644, and then the 911, like the early 911s, were either 901 or the 912 was 902. So that's the first set of part numbers. Right. Modern cars, the first 3 numbers are 996 or 997 and so on. And then the next sequence of numbers, whether it's 352 or those are going to start honing in on whether it's engine, transmission, suspension, and it's all broke down the same way that the old parts books were. And then so you just kind of start to learn those part number sequencing.
I think VW did something similar, like 111, and then like for the Beetle, and 113.
And then 211 was the Type 2.
Type 2.
So you started
familiar.
5 and 6 years old. By the time you're 10, did you know how to build a Porsche? Know every spare part? I mean,
pretty much. Yeah.
That's crazy.
So my dad, there were parts in my dad. So my dad started what was called Porsche Parts Obsolete.
Oh yeah.
So to give you a little insight on, so here my dad, he's parts manager at the Porsche dealership in Newport Beach, and at the time, Porsche, it's pretty fascinating. Porsche was a small car company back then. I mean, it was really kind of living on the coattails of Volkswagen, because Volkswagen was such a massive, corporation. And so all of the parts distribution in the U.S. was done through VOA, or Volkswagen of America.
Right.
So VOA would have these big distribution warehouses, and there was one in Culver City, for example. And, it was like Costco sizes, buildings that are just 30 feet tall, stacked with Porsche parts or Volkswagen parts. So back then there were Porsche dealerships all over. They were small, but there were all these little dealerships in a lot of communities, because they were in conjunction with the VW dealerships.
Yeah.
But they all had a parts department or a parts room that was about the size of your bathroom, And so the problem is that as the models were changing so rapidly, you had just for the 356, you had, what we call the Pre-A now, then the T1, T2, T5, T6, and then they got into the 911s, and there was the 901 that then became the 911 and the 912 and the 914. So there's all these cars that are changing every year. So these parts would all go into these parts departments, and then they'd be like, and Porsche would say, oh, you got to have X amount of parts on, on hand. But then they're like, well, we don't have room for next year. So they'd send them all back to the distributor, right? So what was happening is, here's these big distribution warehouses that are just spilling over with parts.
Yep.
And Volkswagen of America was like, or VOA was like, we got to get rid of this stuff. We don't have any more space. So it was all, and anything that fell off the shelves and anything that was obsolete or considered overstock was being pushed into these rooms, pushed into trash containers, taken to the dump and thrown away.
What?
Because it was more expensive for them to figure out how to warehouse it than the parts were worth. Wow. So my dad was like, this is not good. We're going to need those parts down the road. Mm-hmm. So he went to Chick, his boss, and said, look, we got an issue going on where all the parts are just being thrown away. I was up at the distributor, and there was a stack of steering wheels, and they were 356A steering wheels, and they were being thrown away.
Right.
So Chick says, well, what are we going to do about it? And my dad says, well, why don't we try to see if we can buy that stuff? So they struck a deal with Volkswagen of America to buy all of what was called their distributor obsolescence. And Porsche said, yeah, no problem. We'll sell it to you, but you got to buy it all.
Oh.
And so they handed them, back today we'd get a spreadsheet, right?
Right.
Back then it was a book full of dot matrix, whatever, part numbers in a book. And so they ended up, I think, settling on 6 cents on the dollar for all the stuff. So my dad and Chick rented a warehouse in Costa Mesa, and trucks just started showing up. So I was a young kid at the time, and here I am in these warehouses, and these big shipping boxes that are 4 foot by 4 foot cardboard boxes would show up, and they'd start unloading them. And for me, I mean, I didn't really know what the stuff was, but some of it was fun, like these little paint lacquer sticks that you used to use for touch-up. My dad would say, if you unload that whole box, you can take a box home. So every one of my elementary school projects was done with Porsche
that's cool.
paint lacquer sticks, right?
Yeah.
And I was painting, I'd paint signs, and those things are worth $300 or $400 a vial now. But I used to use them like they were
like magic markers or something.
They were, they were like fingernail polish size, and they were all the trick colors. But so, so my dad, I grew up in that parts warehouse, and then learning kind of the part numbering system and the microfiche. My dad would just let me, kind of have my way with this warehouse, and I fell in love with the cars.
So so now you're getting all the obsolete parts. Like, how big did it get? How many parts did you have?
Porsche parts. So the main warehouse was 10,000 square feet, and then they had some other remote warehouses, but it was stacked floor to ceiling, and it was all organized. Wow. It was very well organized because it was all brand new stuff in brand new packaging, and it was everything from original steering wheels to 4-cam Carrera, heads to 906, stack of 904 and 906, door latches.
Unbelievable. You think about it today, what it'd be worth, right?
Unreal.
It's a treasure, right?
So for how many
Thank
years
God
were
for
the
your
shipments
dad.
coming in?
So it started in the early 70s, and then went until about 1984, 85.
Okay.
So it was it was on an ongoing basis. They also had to buy a lot of the Volkswagen stuff and the Audi stuff, because back then the old Audi 100Ss.
Oh, yeah.
So it was kind of a deal where they had to buy that, but my dad and Chick would take that stuff and sell it off before it got to the warehouse. They'd just sell it for pennies just to kind of get rid of it, because they really just wanted the Porsche stuff. Mm-hmm. So Porsche Parts Obsolete was really the world's kind of clearinghouse,
Yeah, that's amazing.
parts department for everybody that was starting to do restorations, because in the 70s, these cars are now 10, 15, 20 years old, and they're starting to need to be restored.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how did you get to work then? So what happened after that?
So obviously my dad, and my grandfather, this was their life. So I would hang out with my grandfather and my uncle, because I loved the mechanical side and the fabrication side. I can remember as a kid, going to my grandfather's shop, and he hammer welded everything, gas welded everything.
Oh, right on.
So we TIG weld and MIG weld everything, but he was just a purist, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd be standing there while he's working, and he'd say, "Okay, Rod, hold the torch." Because when you're hammer welding, as you're using oxyacetylene, and you're melting the metal, you're adding filler rod, and then you put your torch on your stand, and you grab your dolly and your hammer, and you plenish the weld, and then you kind of move on, right? So instead of using his torch stand, which he had, he would just hand the torch to me.
You were his torch stand.
And then from that point, it became, okay, well, why don't you, you got the torch, why don't you just heat that little area up right there, and then,
so cool.
And then next thing you know, he's like, okay, well, now that you're heating it, because I had goggles on, he'd say, okay, put a little filler rod in there, and then he'd say, oh, I'll do the torch work. Why don't you, I don't want to crawl under the fender. Why don't you get under there and hold the dolly?
So how old are you at this time?
It was as early as 8, 10 years old.
That's amazing.
And so,
that's just the
because
coolest.
my grandfather and my uncle started, after they left the dealership, they started Emory's Porsche restoration in Fallbrook. And so I would spend my summers down there hanging out with my uncle and my grandfather. And it was just this time for me to kind of explore and learn, that side of it. And so learning the parts and every nut and bolt from my dad, and then learning metalwork from my grandfather, or at least being exposed to it. I didn't learn it at 8 years old, but I was exposed to it, right?
Yeah.
And then
You probably learned more than you give yourself credit for.
And my uncle is to this day still, I think, one of the best painters on the planet. And I learned how to paint when I was 10, 12 years old. I'd go down and he'd teach me how to paint, paint parts. I didn't paint cars at 10 years old, but I can remember making a sign for my dad that was a Porsche Parts Obsolete sign, his logo. And, he had me cut it out in metal. I think I was 10 or 11, and I painted it red, and then, we lettered it, and, but I sprayed it. It was just that, it was that early exposure to the craft that instilled kind of the love for that. And then a good friend of my dad's that started. Have you guys ever been to the Long Beach High Performance Swap Meet at Veteran Stadium? It's a big car swap meet. And there was a guy that started that swap meet, Tom Topping, who also started Specialty Fasteners, a kind of drag race fastener company. But Tom had when I was 12, 13 years old, he had bought McEwen's 67 front engine dragster. And he was looking for a crew. And so he hired myself and 3 other kids to be full pit crew. And
How old were you guys?
13?
From 13 to 15. From 13 to 15, I was on a top fuel drag racing team.
Wow.
And traveled all over the country.
Wow.
In 1987, we were NDRA, National, the Nostalgia Drag Racing Champions, in McEwen's 67 front engine dragster. And then in 1988, so I was 88, I was 15 years old. We bought Shirley Muldowney's 86 package, and we ran 87, 88. We ran 5 or 6 NHRA races, and the crew, the mechanical crew was all us kids from 12 to 15 years old.
Child labor.
But so for me,
the good old days.
For
but
me,
what experience it's impossible. Just absolutely incredible. Sorry.
So but that's just it. So for me, that was I learned I was the left side mechanic on an old iron 392 Chrysler,
Right.
top fuel dragster. And so and I was kind of the bigger kid, muscular for my time. Now I'm short, but at the time, so I had to pull the head off left and right, but it was a great experience for me, doing 10, 12 races a year. And then Tom really instilled kind of, the mechanical side in me, that you've got to make sure that everything's dialed in. He had all these little processes that taught me, how to machine stuff, how to take stuff apart, how to, build engines. And then from there, I built my first 356, kind of leading me into the kind of Porsche world. I built my first 356. My dad found a 1953 Porsche, was my kind of first car that I built, a little blue 53 coupe. Rusty car when I was 14 years old, paid $1,200 for it, said, let's build this car. And I finished it when I was 16, and then got my vintage racing license. So that was kind of the beginning of.
You really were bred for
that,
this.
that car right there.
My goodness.
The number
Wow.
80 car. That was the first car that I built I started building it when I was 14, and finished it when I was 16.
So that was your first car.
Right, that's incredible.
That was my first car.
And it's gorgeous, too.
You can find all these podcasts and some really wonderful articles you can't get anywhere else on www.theautopian.com. And P.S., if you love what we do here, you can become a vinyl velour or rich Corinthian leather member of The Autopian by going to theautopian.com and clicking the button that says support us, because as these podcasts are probably demonstrating, we need all the help we can get.